Over the course of the Second World War, the Red Army would come to the harsh realization that most of their tanks were what could best be described as adequate but not optimal. Obviously, a lot of issues could not be fixed on the Soviet Union's primary tanks for fear of disrupting war production. Though history would show that this probably was the right call, this unfortunately meant that the crews in the field would have to suffer the consequences of using a less than ideal product. Well, eventually, many people in both the Red Army and the Soviet Union abroad began submitting their ideas for better tank designs. Unfortunately, the ravages of time have meant that a lot of these proposals either don't exist anymore, or like many other pieces of tank history, are buried in the back corner of some archive. Today, however, we will be discussing a proposal which actually has a decent amount of information on it. The proposal in question? Rozanov's destroyer tank of heavy type. So the story of this particular armored anomaly began in March 1944 when Lieutenant L.V. Rozanov of the 17th Independent Reserve Officer Regiment would submit his proposal to the main directorate of the Armored Forces. Now there's one thing that you should know about most of the proposals that were submitted by soldiers, officers, and citizens of the Soviet Union during the war. They were generally crackpot designs which frequently ignored practicality and feasibility, largely thanks to a severe lack of technical or engineering experience by those who were designing them. Well, unlike many people of his day, Rozanov was actually different. He had spent 7 years prior to the outbreak of the war doing technical work and even had an engineering degree. Now, at a quick glance, aside from some rather, how we say, notable features, the vehicle looks quite ordinary, but it is in fact anything but ordinary. For one thing, the armor of the Rozanov tank was angled even further than the T-34, with the hull's front upper glacis being 32 degrees from horizontal, the upper sides at 45 degrees inward, the armored side skirts at 45 degrees inward, and the upper rear being angled at 29 degrees from horizontal. One of the strangest details with the hull's frontal armor is how it hangs over the sprockets, which was done to accommodate a feature which we will be talking about in a bit. Even the turret was quite radical in its construction, being a low-profile semicircular design which was angled at 55 degrees from horizontal around the sides and rear, with the flat frontal area being angled at 58 degrees. Needless to say, this would give the vehicle a good bit of armor protection even if it were using generally thinner plates. Unfortunately, we cannot say for certain what the armor thickness of the vehicle was, as Rozanov apparently never got around to coming up with those numbers. Now so far this has all been rather mundane, to be honest, compared with the stuff that you have come to see. You may have already noticed some bizarre pieces of steel attached to the hull front and sides. Well, those just so happen to be erectable infantry shields. The idea was that these shields could be raised on the sides and part of the front of the vehicle to give some much needed protection for the improvised infantry riding on the rear and sides of the vehicle. Now, something else that probably immediately stood out to you was that large protrusion in the turret roof. Well, this just so happens to tie into the vehicle's armament. The Rozanov was to be fitted with an auto-loaded cannon, and the bulge in the turret roof was there to allow for some form of gun depression. Regarding said primary armament, apparently Rozanov either couldn't be bothered or simply forgot to specify the caliber and model of the gun, which is unfortunate seeing as it's one of the most alien-looking guns probably ever drawn up. Also, just in case if you were wondering what that soggy baguette thing on top of the gun is, that's the gun cradle, which was mounted externally to free up space inside the turret. Anyway, this mystery gun, as mentioned earlier, was to be auto-loaded and would be fed by a 16-shot belt-style auto-loader, likely similar to that proposed on the T-34 and KV-1. However, knowing the failure rate of such auto-loading systems at the time, Rozanov made sure to include the ability to manually load the gun if need be. Now, unfortunately, in typical channel tradition, we do not have a schematic of the exact design of this system. And the worst part is that we know that the schematic existed, but was apparently removed from the files for some unknown reason and was likely lost after that. When it comes to what would power this tank, Rozanov yet again failed to specify anything. However, However, it is more than likely that a pre-existing engine like the V2 diesel would have been used. What is interesting is that whatever engine would have powered this vehicle would have been sending power to the front, as unlike most late war Soviet designs, this tank was to have its transmission and sprockets in the front, which was done primarily to serve the next purpose, and what has likely been the elephant in the room this whole time. The front of this tank was to be fitted with two what could only be best described as powered trench rollers, which were to be driven via a chain drive attached to the sprockets and could be raised and lowered through two special arms fitted under the front of the vehicle. These rollers were not only predicted to protect the front of the track from damage when crossing incredibly harsh terrain, but would also provide some primitive form of mine protection, as any mines that may be set off would blow up well in front of the vehicle, likely saving the crew and the tank itself. Well, by June 1944, Rozanov was confident in his design. However, that confidence would be pretty quickly shattered when the head of the 8th Department of the Technical Directorate of the Main Directorate of the Armed Forces, Engineer Lieutenant Colonel Frolov, would deliver a rather scathing report which concluded with straightforward rejection of the design. One of the reasons Frolov gave for the tank's rejection was the tank's front rollers, which would hamper the tank's traverse capabilities, as well as adding a bunch of additional weight while at the same time providing no load-bearing capabilities. To further elaborate on Frolov's point, the front rollers in combination with the frontally mounted transmission would have also likely made the vehicle very nose-heavy, with said nose-heaviness likely contributing to further problems with the aforementioned transmission. It's also worth pointing out that those handy-dandy chain drives for these rollers were also incredibly exposed and would be highly susceptible to damage or failure. It's also worth pointing out that neither is it mentioned or is it shown on the schematics any type of system to disengage the rollers. This could potentially indicate that the rollers are spinning at all times, which would only lead to further wear on the already frail chain drive system. The other major point of Frolov's criticism was the inward-angled side skirts, which he believes would greatly complicate maintenance and repair work on the running gear and the suspension, as well as pointing out that Rozanov's claim that these skirts provided mine protection was rubbish, as the skirts were too far away from any critical suspension components to do any good. Now, some other problems that existed that were not explicitly pointed out by Frolov included things such as crew accommodations. Rozanov never bothered to draw up any crew positions, as he likely knew that there was either too little or outright no space for certain crew members such as the driver, thanks to the transmission taking up so much space in the incredibly low-profile hull front. The other issue was that the aforementioned infantry shields when in the raised position could block the turret's traverse, and just to compound that problem even further, either a member of the crew or an infantryman would have to disassemble the shield so that they could traverse the turret around fully again. But the killing blow for the Rozanov tank was the fact that far better tanks were already in development, such as the T-44, which could do most of what the Rozanov could do, far cheaper and far more reliably. As previously mentioned, the Rozanov was never accepted for production. However, strangely, some of its design features would appear on later vehicles, such as the angled side skirts being implemented onto the IS-7, and the circular turret, which became a staple of many Cold War Soviet tanks, like the BMP and the comically inept Object 416. That'll about do it for this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. I know this kind of came out of left field, but that's kind of what I do, I guess. Also, holy moly, 20,000 subscribers. Cannot say I ever thought I would see this day. But I want to sincerely thank all of you for sticking around through my chaotic upload cycle, just life kind of getting crazy. Thank you all. Genuinely, thank you all. And it really means a lot when I hear from y'all that you really like these videos and that they kind of, I don't know, uplift you? I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna go banish something to the Chrysler design dimension now, so bye, I guess?